بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والصلاة والسلام على نبينا Muhammad وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين أما بعد. So last week we did a very quick overview of the Ottoman Empire, and we left off with the beginning of colonialism. But before we get into that, I want to talk about the Mughals. Is that how you say it? Mughal. The Mughals. Mughals. So Mughals, okay. Sometimes we have the English change it. So the Mughals, which were an empire that spanned from present day, where is it? Here. So parts of Pakistan today, pretty much all of India, Nepal, Bangladesh, these areas. This was the Mughal empire, and they were a very, very wealthy empire. So the movies from Bollywood that portray them as being extremely wealthy and having all of these castles and these luxuries, that's actually pretty accurate. Also, one thing that you find in these movies, or at least what I saw from the movie Jalaluddin Akbar, is that there was this attempt to kind of bring more unity between the minority Muslims, the minority ruling Muslims, and the majority Hindus. So at this time, the majority of the population of the Mughals, the Mughal Empire, was Hindu, right? And you had the minority Muslims ruling. So they tried to synergize, create this more unity between these two groups, and the leaders presented or introduced what's called Deen Ilahi. So maybe you've heard this, Deen Ilahi, which is kind of taking elements of Islam and elements of Hinduism and coming up with a new entity, right? Now, obviously, this is very, very problematic. So in the movie Jalaluddin Akbar, he ends up marrying a pagan woman, a Hindu woman. And of course, in Islam, that's forbidden by consensus, by the Quran itself, right? The Quran is clear in that regard. So this creates concerns among the Muslim population. And it spawns a movement of hadith, a hadith movement. People who are trying to revive hadith, revive the sunnah in light of these political realities. Among the major figures of this is Ad-Dahlawi. What's his? Waliullah Dahwali, right? Who is a very prominent scholar, a very, very big scholar. Even in the greater scope of scholarship, he has a pretty high place. So he is one of the people who try and present hadith in new light. And till this day, you have a hadith movement in this area, right? Indian scholars who glorify, revere hadith, right? So that's what's going on. Now, I'm not going to go into details about the Mughals. I don't know much about them, but the reason why I bring it up is because of this issue of trying to create unity by, taking elements of another religion and sacrificing elements of our own. And what you find here in America is that Muslims sometimes try doing this, right? Okay, let's celebrate Christmas because we're all one people and it brings love together. And now you have a nasheed, if you want to call it that, that's pretty much jingle bells, but la ilaha illallah in the jingle bells. Maybe you've seen this, right? I mean, come on, it's absurd, right? We don't have to practice Christmas in order to respect Christians, right? We don't have to practice Christmas in order to build relationships with Christians or be harmonious with them or do work with them. We're doing it with, for example, our masjid here does a lot of interfaith work without doing that stuff. We don't need to put a Christmas tree in the masjid, right, in order to do that. So it is important that we understand that there are red lines in our religion, right, that we cannot pass these red lines, nor should we allow anyone to transgress them. This is it. This is what our religion is. Right? So when it comes to the essentials of our faith, no, we're not going to give up anything of our religion that is clear-cut or that is pretty clear in terms of Quran and Hadith. As Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, قُلْ يَا أَيُّهَا الْكَافِرُونَ لَا أَعْبُدُ مَا تَعْبُدُونَ وَلَا أَنْتُمْ عَابِدُونَ مَا أَعْبُدُ. Say, O disbelievers, right? Those who follow another religion, I don't worship what you worship, nor do you worship what I worship. لَكُمْ دِينُكُمْ وَلِيَ دِينِ. For you is your religion, for us is our religion. Right? So we need to be careful in that regard. Now, I understand sometimes parents are trying to navigate this very, very difficult terrain of being a Muslim, of a foreign ethnicity in a overpowering cultural America, right? And how do we present Islam to our children to where it's not too strict, where if they feel choked and unable to participate in greater society, versus another model where you're allowing them to practice in all of these things in hopes that they don't see Islam as being something confining, right? So that is a tricky terrain to navigate. But you'll have these movements that result because of that. Sometimes they're good and they're positive, sometimes they're not so positive. So the Khawarij, for example, ISIS, Al-Qaeda, I mean, they're really a reaction to the negatives of Muslim society, to the authoritarianism of the Muslim society, to the lack of care of Islam, right? Whether that be at the political or the social level, right? And it spawns these movements. That's just the reality, right? So we got to be careful, and the more knowledge we attain, the more capable we become to navigate this terrain. So knowledge is power. And whenever I speak to the youth, for example, there's one brother who attends a Friday prayer. I see him throughout the week. He says, I come from a Muslim family, but I entered atheism, right? I left Islam and became an atheist. Why? Because whenever I'd ask my dad, why does Islam say this, he can never answer it. To him, the answer was always something emotional, right? Now, there isn't anything wrong with that per se, right? But Islam is more than just emotions. It's more than just an attachment to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Part of it is understanding why we should be attached to Allah. Not just my heart finds rest, right? So it is very, very important that parents understand this. And for the younger ones who are yet to be parents, for you to take advantage of this before Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala provides you with kids, right? To understand the why. And it's not difficult. It just requires a little bit of dedication, a little bit of time. So you have some scholars start a hadith movement. And what's interesting, and I only recently learned this, that this hadith movement of India actually ended up spreading to Yemen and to the Arabian Peninsula, right? Now, this is what time? Around 1750 CE, 1250 Hijrah. 1750, right? Now, who comes about in that time? This guy, Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab, who is the father of Wahhabism. You've all heard of this word. And you've all heard of it in a very negative way, right? Wahhabi. Anytime they talk about ISIS or Al-Qaeda, they always go back to the ideology of Wahhabism, right? It goes back to Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab. And it said that one of his teachers, a Sindhi, is from India, who was part of the movement that was trying to revive hadith. So anyone who wants to start complaining about Wahhabism, it's you guys' fault. It's the Desi's fault. It's not the Arabs' fault. Just as a kind of a little bit of a joke there. Also, another hadith scholar who's also working during this time is Ash-Shawkani in Yemen. Shawkani, who has the very beautiful book Nailul Awtar. He was a hadith scholar of the Zahiri school of thought. So his fiqh opinions are very strange sometimes because the Zahiri opinions tend to be strange. But he was trying to revive a type of critical approach, critical thinking in our approach, or using critical thinking when we approach Islamic texts, right? Because if you remember, by post-Mongols, right, you had the establishment of madaris, the madrasas, right, which created a curriculum for each of these madahibs, and these curriculums became crystallized to where, for the next 700 years, they're using the same exact curriculum, even until this day, right? You'll be reading the same exact books these scholars, or not these ones, but scholars 700 years ago were reading. Now, there's some good to that, in that these books are very, very effective. They are able to build scholars and make scholars. So those who are able to engage these texts and learn them and memorize them, right, and understand them, they will be someone very strong and powerful and influential in terms of their Islamic knowledge, right? But if we are only taking from these books, what happens is we become a little bit too unflexible, to where we don't know how to critically engage the world around us. It's more about copy and paste. Okay, this is the question. Okay, I got to look in my books, copy, pace. That's the answer. And it's not always like that. Fiqh is more dynamic, more flexible than that. So Shawkani is trying to do that. Dahlawi is trying to do that. And you have Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab. Now, the reason why I bring him up is because what he started remains till this day. So Saudi Arabia is, the ideology of Saudi Arabia goes back to this individual. So it's still playing an effect in our times, and ISIS, Al-Qaeda claim that they are influenced by this, but I'll refute that in a moment. And then you have the Salafi movement, which is a very powerful, very widespread movement, is also very much influenced by Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab. So who is this guy? So Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab was born in the early 1700s in a place called Najd. Najd literally means an elevated land. So if you look at the terrain of Saudi Arabia, you have Hijaz, which Mecca and Medina are in, and once you go a little bit east of that, the land starts elevating and it becomes Najd, right? So Riyadh, Dammam, these other, not Dammam, Riyadh and these central Saudi Arabian cities, this is Najd. So he was born and raised there. That's also where Al Saud is from. The House of Saud are from there. And the reason why I mentioned that is because some people try saying that they're from Jewish descendants, right? It's all nonsense. I mean, Arabs they very much preserve their lineage, right? They're not of Jewish descent. They are from this area, right? They're Bedouins. So what was his message? His message was strict monotheism, very much anti-saints, right? Anti-unorthodox practices, anything that has to do with what's called bid'ah, he challenged and fought against, especially against idolatry, pictures, statues, glorifying or revering saints, graves, and all that stuff. Some things that Sufism is still kind of attached to. The grave of so-and-so, and we need to go visit the grave of this wali and the grave of that wali or the grave of that prophet. So he was very much against that. And again, this is still practiced today. Or maybe not today, but prior to 3 years ago, right, this was still going on. If you look at all the graves in Saudi Arabia, right, it's very, very simple. I mean, they don't even have tombstones. They just have that. Why? Because it goes back to this, right? So also he started to fight back against un-Islamic practices like usury, the oppression of farmers, against usury and oppression of farmers and women, right? He was against the oppression of women. So, yeah. Now what he does is the following. Now Muhammad Abdul Wahhab, in order to understand him, we need to understand his context. Right? Now, this is a very Bedouin region. And when we say this is a Bedouin region, it means they're very illiterate. You don't find universities there. Yes, Mecca and Medina are there, but Mecca and Medina are just two religious cities. It's not until our times today where Mecca and Medina have this lavishness, right? Prior to that, you don't find universities here. You don't find schools. You don't find education. It's very simple, right? And at the same time, Sufism became very widespread, extreme types of Sufism. So practices, unorthodox practices spread. He had statues during this time around the Kaaba, right? Graves were there and the whole 9 yards. So Muhammad Abdul Wahhab, understanding his reality, says the following. In order to affect these Bedouins, these uneducated Bedouins, I cannot present them Ibn Taymiyyah thought. I mean, I can't go and present a in-depth book of Ibn Taymiyyah to these Bedouins. They're just not going to understand it. So what he does is very simple 101 books of Islam. And if you read any one of his books, they are meant for the average individual, right? So someone who has any experience in Islam, they'll read the book and say it's as if he's talking to first graders, because he was, right? The Bedouins were of this, mental state, and also, I mean, the average Bedouin didn't know what Ramadan was in Saudi Arabia, present-day Saudi Arabia, in Najd. 5 daily prayers. What's that? This is how ignorant they became, right? So he comes and starts reviving this. What is his mission? Worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala alone and we worship him based on the way the Prophet ﷺ told us to. These are ways what Allah loves is what Allah does not love. We pray 5 times a day, etc. Right? And you have this movement that was very, very effective to the extent that it changed that region until this day. I mean, you're talking about 250 years. Now, why is he hated so much by Muslims and non-Muslims alike? Why is he hated so much? It doesn't have to do with his ideological message. It has to do with the fact that he enforced it, or he's accused of enforcing it. Now, what does that mean? Well, he ends up allying himself with the House of Saud. And the agreement was he takes care of religion, they take care of politics. And until this day, it's the same exact thing. So the Mufti of Saudi Arabia tends to be from Al-Sheikh, right? Al-Sheikh, meaning they're the descendants of Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab. And Saudi Arabia, the Sauds are, the House of Saud, they're the ones still taking care of politics. That's what happens. Now, the House of Saud, being politicians, they tend to expand. They started to expand militarily and to apply the teachings of Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab. Right? This is why they criticize him. They're saying you killed Muslims while you were spreading your message, or you used jihad to spread your message. Right? Now, it's said that Muhammad, he himself never picked up a sword. It was Al Saud who were doing that, right? But in the end, whether he was practicing or participating physically or only intellectually, he's still blamed for this. His brother also, accused him. He said, "You are not applying the Sharia 100%." He didn't accuse him of bringing adulterated understanding of Islam to Muslims. The accusation was, you are forcing this upon us and you are fighting against us, and it's leading to the deaths of Muslims. Okay? So it's important to understand that. So that's why when someone is jihad driven or violent or extremist, they call him a Wahhabi, right? Because they tend to draw similarities between here and there, right? Now, this is a longer discussion. I don't want to get into too much detail, but it's important to really be fair in terms of how we throw this word around, right? Were there some mistakes in terms of the political end? Of course. Of course, that's just the nature of politics, the nature of jihad. But in terms of the ideology that he was presenting, right? I challenge any Muslim who's learned about Islam to critique and criticize what he's saying, to bring evidence that what he's saying is against the Quran and Hadith. Well, it's not going to happen because it's so simple, it's so plain. Right? Allah wants you to worship Him alone. Now, sure, they might come and bring something about the names and attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, about certain secondary issues. But when it comes to the underlying message of what he presented, I mean, it's clear cut. Right? Now, one thing I will say that is important to understand about Sheikh Muhammad is that sometimes he generalizes what he is saying, and this generalization leads to improper understanding of Islam. So one example of that, he says that al-kufr bil-taghut. Part of Iman is disbelieving in this word taghut, or this concept called taghut. Now, taghut means like something that has reached the zenith of mischief, right? And then he says, al-kufr bil-taghut. A taghut is someone who worships. Someone who calls to worshiping other than Allah, someone who calls to an idol, or someone who calls to worshiping themselves. He calls others to worship them, and someone who judges by other than the judge of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? Now, there's a generalization here in this fourth one, and it's very problematic. Now, people who explain his work will try and say, no, what he meant is the following, something more specific, right? But someone who is not educated, someone who does not have deep understanding of these complex issues, they'll take this generalization and they'll start applying it to people. And it can lead to inappropriate applications of the religion, right? So that is something to be warned about, to be careful of. That when you read, if you read what he is saying, you got to understand that sometimes he overgeneralizes what he's saying when it's what he really means, or what he should have said is something a little bit more specific, more clear. Now, so one of the things, or some of the things that he did, is he attacked the Shia shrine in Iraq in 1810 and other Sunni shrines a little later. He annexed Mecca and Medina. Mecca and Medina, during the not his time, but afterwards, was annexed by Al Saud, the house of Saud. And the rulers prior to them were the present-day rulers of Jordan. So the Hashemites, they're the ones ruling Mecca and Medina, right? So you're talking about, this is the time when colonialism starts coming in, and this is when the time when the Ottoman Empire starts falling apart. They start losing control, right? Which provoked the Ottoman Sultan, who had a governor in Egypt named Muhammad Ali, with newly modernized army, defeated the Saudi Wahhabi army in 1812 to 1818. They came back to power about a century later in 1925 as modern-day Saudi Arabia. Okay, so with that, we enter perhaps this is comparable in some ways to the colonialism, comparable in some ways to the Mongol era, in that the effects of it, we still feel it today. But this type of pain is different than the Mongols. If you remember, the Mongols, they entered, they wreaked havoc, they destroyed, they killed, but they never introduced something to the Muslims. They never brought something new. They were an army without a vision. They were an army without an ideology, contrary to the West, the Romans. The Romans, they have a vision and they have an ideology, right? So when they enter a land, they root themselves and they start spreading their ideology. So colonialism does exactly that. And it is very important to understand this. If there's one unit I want you to understand, is this one. Because we are still feeling the aftermath of it today. And perhaps as I go through this, you will start seeing some of these elements in our communities, in ourselves, and in our native countries. So, here is a map of the Middle East, how it was split apart. So at this time, the Khilafah is still together. This light green is the Ottoman Empire. I don't know what flag this is, but there's a different flag. Britain starts taking the eastern part of the Muslim world, meaning the Mughal lands. Egypt and Sudan is colonized by Britain. Libya is colonized by Italy, I think this is. Right? And then Algeria, Morocco is colonized by France. I know once the Ottoman Empire collapses, the French colonize Lebanon and Syria. Palestine is colonized by the Brits. Jordan, the Brits have a presence there, but they don't really colonize it. There's a type of alliance between the Hashemites and the Brits that it's even till this day, right? So the current king of Jordan is the son. His mother is a British lady, right? Yeah. The only place, so Yemen, present-day UAE, the Emirates, Oman, were I don't know, man, it's interesting. They were colonized by Britain. The only area that was not colonized was present-day Saudi Arabia, right? And keep that in mind, because when we ask the question why, right, it's important to understand why. So this is what's going on. Now, what happens is the following. With colonialism, you have a complete rupture, shift from the pre-colonial era. Meaning, when they came in, they didn't just come in and take the Muslim economy and take some resources and go home. They came in and introduced a completely new way of viewing the world, a completely new way of politics, right? And there were 5 things that were introduced through colonialism to the Muslim world. Number 1, and this is in no particular order, the nation state. What is the nation state? The nation state is what today, a country, America. America has borders, right? You're in America, you're You abide by American law. You're outside of it, they have nothing to do with you. So every country has borders. Prior to that, there were no such thing as borders, right? Where you go to a border and now you have to check in with the government, right? Or you have to have a visa in order to enter. Nation states. So when they came, they split the Muslim world into what we see today in these countries, 28 Arab countries, and I think it's 28 Arab countries, right? And so on. Now, with that, you have a completely different style of government that's introduced, right? And I touched upon this in previous sessions, right? If you remember, when I brought the Venn diagrams, right, of how the Muslim politics was working, Muslim governance was working. You have the politicians who deal with the political realm, right? And then you have the religious realm who's dealing with law. The politicians have nothing to do with legislation. It's the Muslims who are the Muslim scholars who are coming up with the laws, right? Now, with a nation state, you can't do that. With a nation state, the state itself has a religion. Meaning, if you look at the constitution of Jordan, it says Jordan is a Muslim country, right? I think Pakistan, the same thing, right? Pakistan is a Muslim country. Now, if you were to bring this, if you go back 700 years from now, right, and talk to the Muslim scholars back then, and say that in our times, our state has a religion, they'd say what? Yeah, the state actually has a religion. I mean, how does the state have a religion, right? It's very strange. It's a completely new concept. How can a state that's not really real have a religion? Right? Okay, now, what does that do? Well, it introduces different dynamics to government, right? Now, when the government legislates or passes a bill, or passes a law, everyone in that country needs to abide by it, which makes pluralism very much challenging. It becomes a very big challenge. How do you deal with this, right? So when you look at America, for example, I guess we're fortunate enough that the country doesn't identify with a religion, although it's predominantly Christian, but the country itself is not technically built on Christianity, right? And therefore, they go outside of that box in order to present certain laws that is encompassing to all members of society. Now, when you have a country that is a Muslim country, right, in order to be true to that, it must introduce Islamic law, right? And since the dynamics is that law is abiding or is binding on every member of society, well, how do you introduce Islamic law or how do you apply Islamic law on non-Muslims? It's a very big challenge. And this is a challenge that the political groups of Muslim groups really I don't think they quite understand, right? How are you going to apply Islam in a country that must be where the laws must be applied on each member of society? How are you going to apply Islam on a Christian? That is against Islam itself. So you get this paradox, this contradiction. How do you navigate that? The nation state. A second thing that's introduced is secularism. And what's interesting, what is the Arabic word for secularism? Ilmaniya. Right? Now, the Arabs, when a foreign word is introduced to them, they just take the word and kind of give an Arabic accent to it. Right? So democracy is in Arabic, demokratiya. Right? What else? YouTube, they'll say YouTube. They just take the English word and give it kind of an Arabic sound to it. But when it comes to secularism, they don't do that. They give it an entirely Arabic word, al-ilmaniya. And when you look at the word, you dissect it, it goes back to alamiya, right? Which means people of the world, right? Why? Allah Ta'ala alam, it seems like when these colonists started entering the Muslim world and started introducing their way of life to the Muslims immediately recognized that these people see nothing more than the world itself. There is no concept, there is no vision of an afterlife. So they call them people of the world. Al-ilmaniyya. These are people who just what they consider is exclusively worldly. They're not concerned with the afterlife. And that is what secularism is. Now, secularism, we got to be careful. because when you say secularism in a Muslim context, right, it's automatically perceived as negative. And that's not really the case, not always. And when you look at scholarship, they will differentiate between secular and secularism. Like they'll differentiate between science and scientism, right? So now we were starting to get into a little bit deeper issues. So when you say science, I believe in science. Like I believe that there's information that is to be attained through this thing called science, right? Scientism, on the other hand, is the notion that we cannot understand except through science. Meaning the only means of coming to a proper conclusion is science itself. And this is really atheists, right? Religious texts have absolutely no value, has absolutely no authority. Well, we as Muslims cannot accept that. Does that mean we are against science? Not at all. Same thing with secular and secularism. Secular means separating or presenting law that is not ingrained in religious texts, right? Now, is there or can there be an instance where Muslims will accept law that is not ingrained in religious texts? You guys know it's a trick question, right? Right? Sure. If the religion has nothing to say about it. Meaning, does the Quran and does Hadith talk about every single issue about our lives? No. Does it talk about the rules of the road? Does it talk about if you go into outer space, what you should do? Not at all. Right? Does it talk about a in-depth form of government or system of government? No. Right? Therefore, if we were to come up with rules for the road, right, that don't go back to some sort of hadith or verse of the Quran, and that is secular. There's nothing wrong with that, right? So Islam, when it comes to fiqh and it comes to law, there is kind of a spectrum. This spectrum doesn't incorporate every element of life, meaning that the Quran is concerned with some aspects of life and neutral on other aspects of life. So here's religious law and here's worldly, world law. Some of Islam is concerned with some of it, not all of it. Now, does that mean there are certain parts of our life that we exclude Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala from? No. Because law is one element, but our engagement with Allah has different dynamics, right? Yes, it is fueled by our understanding of fiqh, but what happens when fiqh has nothing to say about this? Does that mean Allah is excluded? Not at all. So although fiqh doesn't talk about, the Quran doesn't talk about the rules of the road, that doesn't mean we cannot worship Allah by abiding by the rules of the road. Are you following along? This is an important point because, young Muslims who are trying to study Islam, they don't catch this. And they start spewing out incorrect information about Islam. We can accept notions of the secular, without being secularists. We can accept notions when it comes to law exclusively. When it comes to our engagement with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then it is encompassing everything, right? I can worship Allah when it comes to the rules of the road. I can worship Allah when it comes to going into outer space. I can worship Allah when it comes to studying physics, right? I can do that. Right? So they introduced secularism, this concept of separating church from state, right? Now, again, I mentioned that some of law can be secular, validly secular, not all of it. But the challenge of secularism is that it's not just a way of governing, it's actually an ideology. So secular is one thing, secularism is an ideology, right? It has certain principles. And among the principles is that we cannot present law or we cannot present ideas that is ingrained in religion itself. Why? Because it's not reasonable. So you have an individual called John Rawls, and he is a very prominent legal theorist. And he presents this idea called public reason. And what that means is when the government presents a government or a system of government, there are two things that the law must abide by. And that is the one legislating the law needs to have the interest of all people in mind, right? So this is something that needs to be relevant to all people, not just some. Now the level of relevance might differ, but we cannot present something as obligatory law to someone that has nothing to do, or it's irrelevant to them. So for example, if the government were to come and say, citizens of America must celebrate Christmas. So John Rawls would say that's not reasonable. Why? Because it's not relevant to all people, right? And the second condition is that where are they getting it from? Or what is the reasoning behind it, right? So it cannot be embedded in religious text. Why? Because religious text is talking to a particular part of society, not all of society. So Christmas talks to Christians. It doesn't talk to Muslims. And therefore, the government imposing it on all citizens, that would be unreasonable. All right. The second condition is that the way it's presented needs to be logically understandable. Meaning, when you present this information, right, why, let's take a certain law. Let's take insurance, for example. By law, someone who owns a car must have insurance on that car, right? By law. Why? Now, if the reason is because the Bible says so, that's unreasonable. Again, because the Bible isn't relevant to all people. However, if the reasoning is because, for example, to protect and preserve the rights of people who endure damage because of a mistake of a person, right? So someone crashes into another car, they have to have insurance. Why? To preserve the right of that other person, to take care of the costs. If that doesn't happen, then people would be harmed. That is a reasonable argument. Why? Because this argument is now relevant to all people. Does that make sense? Why is this very important? Because now when this is presented to scholars of Islam, when we say alcohol is forbidden, why is alcohol forbidden in Islam? Before that, I'm talking to you as a Muslim. Tariq, why don't you drink alcohol? Because Allah said so. Right? What is the evidence that alcohol is forbidden? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said so in the Quran, in Surah Al-Ma'idah. That's the argument. Now for us Muslims, between each other, that's perfectly fine. But when you put secularism into the play, and now government is working based on secular ideologies, secular ideals, right? What happens? This is no longer a valid argument, right? And this posed a very big challenge to the scholars of that time. Because now they have to they have to change the language in which they present Islam. That's not easy. Because if you remember in the very beginning, I think the first session, I mentioned what Talal al-Asad says. He says that the West has become so powerful, so effective in the spread of their ideology, that we have to play their own game in their courts using their rules. So when we present Islam, we have to present Islam, right, in their game, in their court, using their language. Now the scholars weren't prepared for that. And to an extent, people today aren't prepared for that. I cannot go to a non-Muslim and say, we don't drink alcohol because God said so. Okay, that's relevant to you, but that's not convincing to me. The Quran has no authority to me. Rather, we need to change the language to where it is and what John Rawls is spreading, is talking about. It needs to be public reason. Therefore, when we say alcohol is forbidden, to us, it's not just because Allah said so. When we talk to the community, we need to say alcohol is forbidden because it has negative health. It brings about negative health issues. The amount of deaths that are alcohol related are about 100,000 in the country, right? It could create whatever, all these things. Now we are talking to a secular world. Does that make sense? Do you see how big of a problem, a challenge, I should say, this brought to the Muslim world, and they simply weren't prepared for it. And again, to an extent, we're not prepared for it even today. That's why it's very important that those of us who attend academia here in America, it needs to be balanced between classical, traditional Islamic understanding along with modern Western understanding of the world. It needs to be balanced because the West isn't right in everything. And if our knowledge, our information is only from the West, then that's going to lead to problems in understanding Islam itself. And this is really the problem or the challenge of parents when they talk to their kids. Right? Why is this forbidden? Allah said so. Right? And that's not convincing to me. Now, it's not to say that Allah said so isn't convincing enough. It should be. But in the secular world, it's not. And with our children going to these secular institutions, every university is secular, or at least public, right? They are secular, atheistic, liberal institutions. That's their goal, right? So that's secularism coming in. Another major challenge is liberalism. Liberalism has certain principles, and next week, inshallah, I'll go back into this because this is very important. I'll go into more detail, but perhaps giving you bit by bit because these are deep concepts will help build the idea in your mind. Liberalism has certain principles. Among the principles of liberalism is this concept of autonomy, that you are the authority of yourself. You tell yourself what's right, and you tell yourself what's wrong, right? And part of being autonomous is that there is no external authority that is commanding you, right? Okay, why is that a problem? It's because the Quran is an external source commanding you. When our minds are built on the notion that I am the judge of myself, or I am to tell myself what to do, and you hear this from the kids, don't tell me what to do, right? I'm sure all the parents have heard this. Don't tell me what to do, or at least you've seen it on TV. Where does that come from? It comes from liberalism. I am autonomous. I am the authority of myself. So when a person views the world from that lens, and you say the Quran is telling me to do this, well, I'm telling myself to do something else. They made their self pretty much the authority above God. Subhanallah. Wa hasha lillah. That's the reality. And again, I'll go into more details next week. And then capitalism is also introduced. Now, capitalism is a system of economy, right? And capitalism, if you were to, and I'll give you diagrams next week, inshallah. If you were to draw a spectrum between capitalism here and socialism here, the Islamic understanding of an economy is over here. It's closer to capitalism. And so it's not in between, it's closer to capitalism. But what does capitalism do? A lot of it is in accordance to Islam, right? But there are some fundamental differences between capitalism and a Muslim ideal of an economy. Perhaps the main thing is that the goal in capitalism is profit. Your goal as a business person is profit. Whereas in Islam, the goal of business is essentially what? What's that? Ajr? It's to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's it. Meaning you use your means, your sustenance, to give yourself energy to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The main goal is not profit, right? The main goal is worshiping Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now what that does is the following. When it comes to charity, when it comes to your vision, how do I approach this? Right? If my goal is profits, first and foremost, that puts the group, the society, as second. Whereas in Islam, it's not always the case. Right? There are many incidents or many fiqh rulings where the reason why it's forbidden, one of the reasons, is that it affects greater society. So take, for example, interest. Interest is very much good for the one taking interest. Come on, it's free money. Literally, it's free money. So from a capitalistic understanding of economy, well, interest is good because I'm making profit, right? But from the Islamic understanding of it, it's bad because it's harming greater society. So we're not going to give one person the privilege of making extra money on the expense or at the expense of greater society. Same thing, for example, with alcohol, right? For someone opening up a business in alcohol, they'll make a lot of money, but at whose expense? At society's expense, right? So that's one main difference. The goal in capitalism is profit, whereas the goal in Islam is worshiping Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's not to say that we shouldn't pursue profit, but it's not the end goal, right? Another major difference is interest. So capitalism is very much, interest is embedded in our economies today, very much embedded, and whereas in Islam, it's not. It's forbidden. Capitalism does not really have a formal system of redistributing wealth. So in a capitalistic society, the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. That's the reality. That's how capitalism works, right? Now, that's not to say it doesn't have other virtues. Why does it work that way? It's because, for example, let's take our current times today. The economy today is stronger than it was before the crash in 2008. Right? The stock market is higher now than it was in 2008 before the crash. But we still feel the negative aftermath of the crash. Why? Well, although money was created, right? Who was able to take advantage of that newly created money? The rich. So the rich got a lot richer, right? And the middle class is shrinking, and the number of poor people is getting greater. So although the economy is stronger number-wise, in terms of the distribution, it's actually weaker. So capitalism, as far as I know as of now, it does not have a system of redistributing wealth. In Islam, there is a system of redistributing wealth, and we call it zakah, right? Zakah, sadaqah, charity, waqf, endowments, right? Among other things. Again, next week, perhaps I'll go into a little bit more detail. The fifth one, I forgot. What is it? Nation state, secularism, liberalism, capitalism. There's one more. I'll get it for you, inshallah, next week. But let's go ahead and end there. Inshallah, next week I'll go into more detail. Are there any questions? You have a question? No? Jibreel.
What exactly would you say is the definition of a state? Like, I've always wondered about that because like say Israel being a Jewish state. Like, what is a state exactly?
So I think I don't know the precise definition for it, but a state is going to be an entity of land that has clear borders, and maybe is autonomous or has some form of government.
The title was saying 5 systems, but it listed 4.
Yeah, so I forgot the fifth one. Inshallah, I'll get it to you next week. You're welcome.
So is Wahhabism a positive effect on the Muslim society?
It depends on who you ask. I mean, it was very positive for Saudi Arabia. Very positive for Saudi Arabia. I mean, again, it really depends on who you ask. I think the ideology he introduced in terms of the focusing on monotheism is very much positive. I mean, that's Ibn Taymiyyah talking, right? But he presented it in a more basic way. So I don't know what to say beyond that. It really depends on who you ask.
Did he ignore Abu Hanifa, Shafi'i, and all that?
Did he ignore? No, he was a Hanbali. Hamd Abdul Wahhab was a Hanbali. Yes.
So this is not related to. I heard you saying a waqf.
A waqf is an endowment. So a waqf in Islam is when someone offers something that is to be used for a public service that is to an extent free, right? So, for example, Umar radiallahu anh went to the Prophet ﷺ. He said, "I have this piece of land in Khaybar. I don't know what to do with it. What should I do with it?" He said, "Make it a waqf, make an endowment." So Umar radiallahu anh made it an endowment, and it had trees in it, that anyone who is poor, who's an orphan, who's traveling, right, and walks by his land, they're able to eat from it. Right? And waqf was very much utilized by Muslims, very much. And I mentioned this in that at one point of time, studies show that 50 to 70% of public services in Muslim cities were waqf. Hospitals were waqf. Right? A lot of academic institutions were waqf. So your education is free, your medical expenses are free, all of it is free. And what's funny is that one of the reasons why this was very much promoted by scholars, not just because of the reward that comes out of it, but because it really limited the amount of income that's flowing through the government itself. Right? So the scholars were also interested in limiting the amount of money the governors and the emirs had, because the more money they have, the more power that they have. So look how smart that is. Right? So not only are we catering to greater society, we're also limiting the tyranny of, or the potential tyranny of the state. SubhanAllah. So what colonialism does, by the way, is when they enter, they completely abolish all these waqfs. Completely destroy it. And I'll talk about that, inshallah. And you'll see how that affected the politics versus the politicians versus the scholars dynamics, inshallah. Other questions? Yes.
What type of government is Dubai considered?
It's a federal government, where there are multiple states that go back to one federal government. So it's like America. America has 50 states, and there's one federal government. Right? So the same thing, the Emirates. There's state level law and there's federal level law. If the federal government legislates something, it is binding upon the entire country. But if the federal government does not dictate or pass a bill on an issue, but the state does, now that law is binding upon the members of the state, or those who are in the state. Does that make sense? Okay. Any other questions? What's that? All right. You have?
One question.
Sure.
You know, like for example, late fee, when you pay a late fee, is that considered as a riba as well?
No, that's not interest. Interest is only on loans. A late fee, you missed a payment. That's not a loan. Or I'm sorry, I should be a little bit more specific. So let's say you have a parking ticket. If you don't pay about a certain time, they charge you a fee. A parking ticket is not a loan, right? The sheriff's department isn't loaning you $30 and saying you have to pay it back at this time. They're saying you owe this because of a violation. You see? So interest is only on loans. Now, a credit card that says, right, if you don't pay at this time, we will charge you, that is interest because it's on a loan. So that's a big difference. Car payment, for example. You have a lease, right? A lease is a rental. You are renting this car. You're renting the benefit of this car. That's not a loan. So therefore, if you are late in paying, making a payment, that late fee is not interest. It's just a penalty. Yes.
What do you know about money factor on the leasing the car?
What is it? Money what?
Money factor, it's called money factor. They have like extra money you have to pay when you lease a car. They say it's not insurance, it's a money factor. But it's
Again,
also-
leasing a car is a rental. It's not a loan. So even if they incorporate certain numbers that comes from interest-based, whatever transactions, it's still a rental. It's not a loan. So there is no interest there. Interest is only on loans. Now go ahead and lease cars. You're okay. وصلى الله بنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين.